Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Sanctuary. It is week 12. It is Thanksgiving week. Happy Thanksgiving to you all. And of course, that means an incredibly exciting slate of games. We have got the Thanksgiving Day games. We've even got a Black Friday game. And of course, we've got all the beautiful Sunday games as well. Tom and I are here to preview every single game of this week's matchup. We will talk through redraft, dynasty, and of course, you'll get all of Tom's DFS nuggets. Let's dive straight into it. The early Thanksgiving game, the starter before the main course. Quite an exciting matchup. I think with how Jordan Love played last week, it makes this matchup even more intriguing. Tom, is there something that you're particularly looking at to attack this week?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Chargers defense absolutely sucks. And we kind of talked about this last week, that the Chargers had only held some incredibly bad quarterbacks to under 21 points. Every serviceable, startable quarterback had scored over that point. Jordan Love scored, I think it was 20.9 points, which kind of summed it up, really. Like, he was right on that kind of boundary of what other quarterbacks have been doing well. But this week, I really like the Lions. I think that they're a good team. They've allowed the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So it's not an area that they've completely clamped down on opponents. I think that what the Packers will have to do well is to really get their pass catchers involved. The Lions rank 14th against wide receiver ones, 31st against wide receiver twos, 18th against wide receiver threes. So getting the likes of Jaden Reed involved, who we've seen be very productive over the last few weeks, getting the likes of Romeo Doubs involved. Christian Watson has to get going at some point. You know, he scored a touchdown last week, but he's still been one of the worst picks in fantasy football this year. So I have a little bit less faith in AJ Dillon. You know, he's not somebody I've been particularly high on at any point this year. His splits with and without Aaron Jones are pretty much identical. He scored like 0.3 PPR points more when Aaron Jones hasn't been on the field. They seem to actually use him less in the receiving game in games without Aaron Jones than in games with him. When Aaron Jones is playing, they both mix into that receiving role sometimes. But when Aaron Jones is out, they seem to want to use one of their additional backups for that. It'll be interesting this week because with Aaron Jones injured, with the backup whose name escapes me right now, they've hit the point where they're re-signing James Robinson off the street, and the other running back, Patrick Taylor, is it, who was formerly with them, who never did anything. But the Lions defense, you know, they rank 8th in DVOA against the run. They rank 12th against the pass. They're not an easy defense to have your way with. And for me, this game, if I'm attacking this for the Thanksgiving slate, I'm looking at this purely from the Lions side. I think you look at David Montgomery with 192 yards and 2 touchdowns in his last 2 games. Gibbs, 26 targets in his last 4, 5 rushing touchdowns in his last 4. Amon-Ra, you know, he averages 21.3 points per game. So all of those players feel really easy picks. I've talked in our Discord this week about how on Thanksgiving slates you can get a little bit weird. You can try things you wouldn't normally. And that's where I've landed on that, you know, I'll definitely have at least one lineup where I put both David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs in because we've seen them both be fantastically good at the same time. The Packers have struggled against the run plenty this year. You know, they allowed Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris to both be top 10 running back options a couple of weeks ago. But basically everything that Detroit does well, the Packers struggle to defend against. You know, they are ranked 14th against wide receiver 27th against wide receiver ones, and they're ranked 25th in DVOA against tight ends. So this could be the kind of get-right spot that Sam Laporta needs after 2 games outside the top 12. And I think if you're looking at this from the Lions side, as long as you're adding at least 2 pass catchers to Jared Goff stacks, I don't think you're going to go wrong.
Yeah, it's interesting you talking about potentially a get-right week for Sam Laporta. I want it to be true. There's this trend that when Gibbs and Montgomery have both been healthy and used extensively, Laporta's basically been the one to miss out in this offense. I'm hoping that that's just small sample size. I think that Laporta's good enough that he can produce even with Gibbs, Montgomery, St. Brown fully firing in this offense. I think if we see it this week, maybe we need to start believe that it is a trend. On the other side of the fence, AJ Dillon, you said his splits don't change whether Aaron Jones is playing or not. That's because AJ Dillon's not very good. Like, he's not very good with Aaron Jones in the lineup. He's not very good without him. The player I want to touch on, though, is Tucker Kraft. Luke Musgrave's gone on IR. We know that he was the rookie that broke out and was looking good. I rather famously said I thought Tucker Kraft was a better NFL prospect as a receiver than Luke Musgrave. That's perhaps not looked great through 12 weeks. But do you think there's any interest potentially in this week at 2.5K on DraftKings? Could he potentially sneak in as a sneaky play this week? You're on mute, Tom.
So yeah, Luke Musgrave's now on IR with a lacerated kidney after he fell on the ball. That's definitely a new one that I've not seen before. With Kraft, yeah, it's definitely been a much slower start to the season for him. You know, he's had 5 total touches through 11 games, and I think what you're kind of hoping for here with any of these tight ends in this 2,500 range is that they're going to do enough to give you a real difference-making score compared to the guys like George Kittle on the Thanksgiving slate, like Sam Laporta. And I just find it really difficult to believe that that's going to actually come to pass. So for me, I'm just not really interested in these tight ends. I think perhaps if they were maybe the second tight end on a team and you were looking to put them into flex, possibly. But, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if you see Josiah DeGuara still out there plenty, Ben Sims out there. I think, you know, Kraft's played the most snaps of these 3, playing 31% compared to DeGuara's 22%, Sims 9%. But I don't think it's going to be like for like. And the Lions allow the 9th lowest catch rate to opposing tight ends. So it just feels like you're really praying for a touchdown. And even then, it might not be enough to do the business.
Yeah, maybe I'm digging too deep into the weeds. If you're here, if you're watching live, get those questions in the comments below. We love answering all your start, sit, trade questions. Fire them in. We will answer 100% of those questions. The next matchup, the main course of this Thanksgiving slate, we have got Washington at Dallas. This feels like this could be an absolute barn burner. I'm feeling points, Tom. Are you buying into this?
I certainly hope we're going to see points because this is the one which, yeah, like you say, it could end up being a bit of a barn burner. There's plenty of reason to believe this is going to be a fun one. I think, you know, you go back, and particularly this Thanksgiving slate in general feels so much better than some of the ones we've had in previous years. You know, the Lions are competitive. The Commanders are competitive. You know, they're a team who crops up on Thanksgiving now and again. And the Cowboys are interesting. So the Commanders' defense, they rank 32nd against the pass. They rank 10th against the run, setting this up to be more of another pass-heavy game for the Cowboys, which is something they've been leaning into over the last few weeks. They've been very pass-heavy. And on offense, they rank 10th in the passing game and 22nd in the run game. What we've kind of seen from the Commanders is that they do just help generate fantasy points because they play at a fast pace. They've got a terrible defense. They've allowed 7 of the last 8 quarterbacks who face them to finish as a top 12 quarterback. They allow the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Sam Howell, he's been a QB1 in the last 7 of his 8 games. So I think there's also upside for him. Dallas struggle against rushing quarterbacks. They've allowed 5 different rushing quarterbacks to have 35 or more yards this season. Brian Robinson looks good. He's coming into this game with back-to-back 100-yard rushing games. But he's also had 15 targets. That's more than he had in the entirety of his rookie season. And if Antonio Gibson misses out, he's a true game-time decision, then I could probably talk myself into Brian Robinson. But generally, I think this is a game which is going to be more interesting through the air. I'm not sure that I'll be playing more than one Commanders pass catcher in DFS. I think in redraft, you know, if you need to start Jahan Dotson, you need to start Jahan Dotson. But in DFS, I think you can probably limit it to one because the Cowboys have been excellent against pass catchers all year. In DVOA, they rank 5th best against wide receiver 1s, 7th best against wide receiver 2s, 1st against wide receiver 3s. The chink in their armor is tight end, where they rank 22nd. So Logan Thomas, who's coming into this averaging 6.6 targets per game since week 7, feels like kind of player which would be interesting. I think Jake Ferguson's going to be very popular on the other side of the game, and that in itself will give you a little bit of leverage. On the Cowboys side of things, outside of CeeDee Lamb, who has just ascended to the pure elite status, I think you can probably sprinkle in one more in Dak stacks. There's 8 different wide receivers who scored 20-plus points against the Commanders this season. Brandon Cooks is second in target share since the bye week with 12%. Jalen Tolbert has actually out-targeted Michael Gallup since the bye week with 16-13. So I don't mind taking shots on either of those two. Gallup at a push. And then, Jake Ferguson, 22 targets in his last 3. The Commanders have allowed the 8th most receiving touchdowns to tight ends. So there's just plenty of ways you can attack this. I think, if you're looking at the 3-game DFS slate, then putting Pollard in there as well as Dak and 2 pass catches is fine. But ultimately, it's hard to see this one letting us down, really.
Yeah, I think if you're looking to attack this Thanksgiving slate, and as you said, in that 3-game lineups, I think this is the one that you want to be trying to get as many pieces into that lineup as you can, because as you said, some of those Cowboys players are very intriguing. I really like Jahan Dotson this week. I think that he's potentially got an interesting matchup moving around the offense against, potentially a decent Dallas defense, but I think there should be some holes still. And as you said, Brian Robinson, if Antonio Gibson's out, it feels almost like he's a plug-and-play back-end RB1 almost, just because of the pure volume he's going to get. We have got a question in the chat, though. Bronson saying, trade Trevor Lawrence and Dalton Kincaid for Josh Allen. What are your thoughts?
I mean, Josh Allen's definitely kicked into gear this, over the last few weeks. He's been fantastic after those couple of down weeks. He definitely bounced back. He's had 1 game below 22 points in the last 5. But I'm just not sure I want to give up Dalton Kincaid. I know Dawson Knox is eligible to come off IR, but they said that he's not ready yet. And I just think what we've seen from Kincaid is real and quite valuable at the onesie position.
Yeah, I think the value is probably about right. I think it's a pretty fair trade. I don't love it unless you've got, as you say, another tight end option, unless you're quite deep that you can afford to kind of upgrade to the star. I think I'd probably lean the T-Law and Kincaid side, unless you've got another tight end that you can kind of plug and play for replace Kincaid as such. And then moving on to the dessert, the final course of our Thanksgiving Day meal. Call it the pecan pie, the pumpkin pie, whatever you want. San Francisco at Seattle. Seattle's obviously pretty banged up. Just before we came live, Geno Smith questionable, looks like he's going to play, but Kenneth Walker doubtful, looking unlikely to play. Does this mean Zach Charbonnet in every single lineup you can get him?
I'm not too sure about it, to be honest, because, last week we saw he had, what did he have? He had 21 touches and ended up with 69 yards altogether, 47 on the ground from 15 rush attempts, and then 6 for 22 through the air. So it doesn't feel like the most productive spot for him. The Niners, they do allow the 8th most receptions per game to running backs. They gave up good games to Rachaad White and Joe Mixon in recent weeks. They both had over 17 PPR points. But I kind of worry about what we see from Pete Carroll. We've seen these kind of situations before where the lead back goes down and we're ready to just saddle up to it. And then players like DJ Dallas just mix in and just take just enough of the high-value touches, those receptions, bits like that, that it just takes the edge off how good a play they are. I don't mind playing Zach Charbonnet in fantasy this week. I think I'll be starting him in my home league where my running back situation is quite a mess. But in DFS, I feel like there's possibly better options. It's quite an affordable slate. They price everyone down for Thanksgiving because they want all the people who don't play often to come in and actually enjoy being able to build a lineup. And I feel like there's possibly more affordable options who I'd rather play. Outside of Charbonnet, though, like on the Seahawks side of things, DK Metcalf had a good day. It's kind of been coming. We've talked about this, about how many red zone targets he's had. He's only had 3 touchdowns all year. All of them have come in the red zone, which isn't what we'd normally associate him with. We want to see him breaking those big runs. But the Niners, they they do give up fantasy points to wide receivers. They've given up decent days to plenty of wide receivers lately. They rank 10th best against wide receiver ones in DVOA, but the production's still been there at times. I think Tyler Lockett is dealing with these persistent hamstring injuries that have really been bothering him for a few weeks now, and has kind of seen his fantasy production tail off a little bit. And then JSN wasn't a player I felt particularly excited to play this week, but then with Tua Hufanga being added to the injured reserve with a torn ACL, maybe that opens up the middle of the field a little bit more, and we see more from JSN being that outlet. If Geno Smith needs to get rid of the ball quickly, I think that's possibly going to materialize. But on the other side of things, the Seahawks, they allow the 14th most fantasy points to wide receivers, the 7th most to slot wide receivers, which kind of aligns more with Deebo Samuel than Brandon Ayuk, who plays on the outside more, which is more of a tough matchup. The Seahawks cornerbacks are pretty decent. But Ayuk, I mean, he looked fantastic last week, broke that long run, 26 fantasy points. That was his first top 20 week since week 4. So it'd be nice to see him build off that. And then George Kittle, I mean, I was wrong about George Kittle. I thought he'd struggle to be relevant when he wasn't scoring touchdowns this year, but he's proven me wrong. He's been excellent. And I think if you're looking at this Thanksgiving slate and building lineups, you have to put Christian McCaffrey in as many as possible. The Seahawks allow the 6th most fantasy points to running backs, the 7th most running back receiving yards per game. McCaffrey's at 20 points in 4 straight games. Like, fading McCaffrey is an easy way to end up losing, I think.
Yeah, look, I feel like, Tom, we might need to have an intervention here about the Deebo love. We had plenty of conversations in the offseason, Ayuk versus Deebo, and it feels like you still want to big up Deebo, the guy. I get the stats, but Ayuk is just an absolute stud. He's balling right now. I think that maybe we need to have a further conversation and revisit this at a later time.
Well, let's have a further conversation about Brandon Ayuk. Since week 3, these are his fantasy finishes: wide receiver 36, wide receiver 33, wide receiver 35, wide receiver 22, wide receiver 22, before wide receiver 5 last week. The Brandon Ayuk hype is deserved because he's a fantastic player, but the fantasy production doesn't justify quite the level of hype that he's been getting this year.
All I hear from you there is just consistency. There was that top 36 every week. Okay, he might not have the huge boom weeks, but we know that's going to come in this offense. Okay, there's so many weapons with Christian McCaffrey eating up so much. We know that he's not going to have 30, 40-point weeks because the volume's never going to be there. But he's never disappointing you. Of those weeks, what's he putting up in almost every single one of those weeks? It's 15 points plus a week in, week out.
9.8 PPR points, 11.6, 10.7, 15.9, 14.5.
Yeah.
There's a good few disappointments in there.
I think that, and we just got to admit, what's Deebo Samuel done in that time?
Oh, absolutely. No, I thought Deebo Samuel would be far more productive than he's been, but I'm just saying this week the matchup seems to look favorable for Deebo, and I guess we'll see.
Absolutely. But we've got some questions. Raphael's saying 0.5 PPR trade. This feels like a big one. Jalen Hurts, Dalton Kincaid, Chris Olave, and Saquon for CMC, Kupp, and Pittman. And his team would be absolutely loaded and completely ridiculous. What are your thoughts, Tom?
I'm not sure that I want to have Kupp and Puka on the same team at the minute. I feel like the Kupp injury issues are going to linger a little bit. I think that Puka is at his most productive when Kupp isn't out there. And I don't think I really want to be acquiring Kupp, but otherwise, yeah. I mean, it's any trade that gets you CMC is fantastic. Michael Pittman's on target for 167 targets this year, so yeah, I'd be fine acquiring them, but if I can find something else instead of Kupp, I'd probably do it.
Yeah, I wonder if the move is to remove Kupp and Pittman, because I don't think you need them. Can you do Saquon, Olave, and Kyler, and maybe you get to keep Jalen Hurts for CMC or something like that? Like, I wonder if you can kind of shrink down the trade just for Christian McCaffrey, because Cut, as you said, Cup, Puka, don't like having on team. Pittman just feels like a bit of a luxury. So I wonder if you can shrink down the trade, it might be a little bit better. Rory, one of our members in the chat, suggesting he doesn't like it when we disagree, Tom. Maybe we'll just continue singing from the same hymn sheet from here on out. Exciting times, though, Tom. We have got the first ever Black Friday game. And of course, they've rolled out the red carpet. They've got the best quarterback ever, Tim Boyle, Mr. I threw 1 touchdown and 13 interceptions at UConn in college, and is now starting an NFL game for the Jets. This can only go badly.
Yeah, and I think the Dolphins are favored by 10 in this game. And regardless of how good the Jets' defense is, it just feels like this is going to be a miserable affair for the Jets, really.
Yep.
Like, Zach Wilson was diabolical against the Bills. He had 81 passing yards before he was benched after falling over walking onto the field. And it was just, that was the perfect last glimpse into Zach Wilson's career in the NFL. And frankly, it should have come weeks ago. But I mean, I can rattle off a bunch of stats about how the Jets allow the league low fantasy points to wide receivers, the 11th fewest QB fantasy points. They allow, they're more of a run funnel. So perhaps this leans more towards Miami's running game. Devin Achan is apparently questionable. I feel like it would be a bit daft to play him, given it was a reoccurrence of the issue that put him on IR. And I think, you can lean into what you need to lean into. Jalen Waddle, we keep saying it every week, but this week, the matchup actually looks slightly better for him. He has better stats against the kind of coverage that the Jets use, cover 4, cover 6, rather than Tyreek Hill. So if you need to start Jalen Waddle, perhaps this is a week where he actually pays off. Garrett Wilson, he was averaging 8 catches for 93 yards over the last 3 games before Buffalo. Breece Hall, he's at over 50 rush yards once in the last 5, but Miami are a pretty tough team against the run. They've allowed the 7th fewest running back fantasy points, but they do allow the 3rd highest yards per reception, so perhaps he gets there through pass catching work. But overall, I'm expecting an efficient Dolphins performance. I would be surprised if Tua ends up getting enough points to finish inside the top 12 quarterbacks. I think they'll just get there on efficiency and then run the game out.
Yeah, I sadly tend to agree with everything you said. I mean, look, this Jets team is averaging 8 points a game the last 3 weeks with Zach Wilson under center. As bad as Zach Wilson's been, Tim Boyle is going to be a massive downgrade. And I just think that I'd be shocked if the Jets put up double-digit points, let alone stay competitive in this. Maybe I'm just a down and depressed Jets fan yet again. A couple of people in chat. NBA Rig, thanks for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving. And Pat, one of our members, is asking Deontay Johnson or Jerome Ford this week. Where are you going there?
I quite like Deontay Johnson. I think maybe we get the dead cat bounce from the Pittsburgh offense. And Jerome Ford, we saw a bit of a reduction in role last week after being positive for the 2 previous weeks. And it's just enough to give me a little bit of pause.
Yeah, I think I've gone pretty close. I'd lean Jerome Ford. I just think that Denver, have been better the last few weeks, but I'm very concerned. I think I'd go Ford here. I also need to know a little bit, Tom. What the hell's a dead cat bounce? I've never heard that one before. Is that a northern saying?
Never heard? Yeah. Well, even a dead cat bounces when you throw it over the floor.
That's a new one to me. So there you go. If you're listening and you've heard that, let me know in the comments, because I reckon Tom's making that up. That's not a real fair saying. If you are here, though, and you are watching and you've not hit that subscribe button, we want to help you win fantasy championships. We're doing it for all our members. We're doing it for people that consistently watch. You become one of those people. Hit that subscribe and you will win more fantasy titles. Moving across to the Sunday slate. Sunday, the early games look absolutely abysmal. This is maybe the most interesting. New Orleans at Atlanta, the battle for the South. Do we think that Desmond Ridder, the new starter for the rest of the season, is going to lead a bounce back for this Atlanta Falcons? They get back on the winning trail?
Not particularly. I think we know what Desmond Ridder is. I think Arthur Smith was right to bench him at the time that he did and to see whether Taylor Heineke could come in and give them a boost. But Desmond Ridder was woeful across the start in portion of this season. I don't think that we're going to see him magically be far better after 2 games riding the bench and the bye week. The Saints have allowed the 13th fewest quarterback fantasy points. They've allowed the 3rd fewest running back fantasy points, the 9th fewest to wide receivers, and the 13th most to tight end fantasy points. So if I was going to tell myself a story based purely on stats, it would be that this is the time for Kyle Pitts to come healthier out of the bye and actually, build off the fact that he played the second most snaps of the year pre-bye at 70%. And now we're going to see him actually go out there and be good. But Desmond Ridder is just so diabolically inaccurate that I can't believe that that's going to happen against this Saints defense. On the Saints side of things, it sounds like Derek Carr is going to clear concussion protocol in time. Kamara, we've seen his rushing work just dip. He averaged 17.2 rush attempts over his first 5 games back. He's had no more than 9 in the last 2. Chris Olave, honestly, I just want to see Jameis Winston throwing balls to Chris Olave.
It was sexy last week, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like he has had back-to-back games as a wide receiver 1 before the bye week, and that's been his most productive fantasy stretch of the season. But that was at points where Jameis Winston was in and out of the lineup. And maybe with Michael Thomas now going to IR, we actually see that passing game focus a little bit more towards Chris Olave. Michael Thomas wasn't good for fantasy, but he was consistently averaging like 5 for 50 every week or so, 4 for 50 yards. And if those yards go to Chris Olave, then he could definitely be a lot better down the stretch.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that I want to see about this Saints offense is that we saw Thomas get injured, and basically rather than Rashid Shaheed stepping into a bigger role like many people hoped, it was A.T. Perry that came in and took over those snaps as the big-bodied ex-outside receiver that's going to do the grunt work. I'm wondering if now they've had some time away to spend and think about it and look about it, they know that Rashid Shaheed is such an explosive weapon. I wonder if we don't see such a clean cut of A.T. Perry's going to be a 80, 90% snap share guy. I wonder if we see an increase in Shaheed's targets. We see an increase in those snaps, and hopefully that can lead to a little bit more consistent fantasy production, because when he hits, he's been incredible. I think he's had 3-4 top 5 weeks, and then everything else has been outside the top 50. So he is the epitome of a boom bust guy. If he starts to get into some more production, more consistent volume, maybe we get to see a little bit better production on a down-to-down, week-to-week basis.
Yeah, just picking up on NBA Riggs' question in the chat, will New Orleans lean more on Carr's arm or Kamara's legs this game versus Atlanta's defense? It's a good question, because Atlanta, they're a sneaky good defense. We've talked at times about their ability to clamp down on wide receiver 1s. They use a lot of like double coverage on players where Jesse Bates, safety, shadows slightly over towards him as well. And they've allowed the 10th fewest points to wide receivers, but they've been very good against wide receiver 1s. So maybe Chris Olave is going to have a poor game, and it opens up for Shaheed and A.T. Perry. But also, the Falcons have allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points to running backs. So I don't really have a good read on this game in terms of how I see it playing out. I think that these kind of divisional matches can always get a bit crazy and weird things can happen. But yeah, if I had to guess, this is the kind of game which is going to, be several points under the under of 42.
Yeah, I tend to agree as well. We've gone from talking about a new quarterback, questionable quarterback in Desmond Ridder. Let's talk about 2 questionable quarterbacks. Kenny Pickett, Browning. Canada's gone. We can't blame Canada anymore. Is this Pittsburgh offense going to completely explode and, all these amazing fantasy weapons suddenly become fantasy superstars again?
Well, there was a report today, I forget who originally reported it, but I read it on Roto World, saying that it could be Jalen Warren and George Pickens who benefit the most from this new scheme. The offensive coordinator who's taken over is the running backs coach. And what was crazy last week was that Jalen Warren was absolutely getting loose constantly. 2nd game in a row where he had over 100 scrimmage yards. And he led all running backs last week in total rushing yards. He also was ahead of any other running back in yards after contact, ahead of whatever amount of yards any other running back had. He was a pure stud. And then in the 4th quarter, they go completely away from him into Najee Harris, who averaged 2.9 yards per carry against Cleveland. It just wasn't the game for him. I think against the Bengals, They played quite well against the Ravens' run attack last week, but that's been an area that they've struggled with at points this year. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the Steelers lean quite run heavy. And what I'm looking for is to see Kenny Pickett getting some passes across the middle of the field. Matt Canada, so much of the stuff was to outside the numbers, which in itself is making life difficult for both the receivers and the quarterback there. Higher variance targets. So, yeah, if we do get wide receiver targets, I'd like to see that. I think, you look at the Bengals and they've allowed a middle of the table, sort of 16th most fantasy points to wide receivers. They've allowed 16th most fantasy points to running backs. Whereas on the other side of this, if you're looking for players you can play again on the Bengals, it's going to be very interesting. I thought Jake Browning came in and did very well against the Ravens defense in so much as coming in halfway through a game against a very good defense when you've not been prepped for it. The only touchdown he did get was a garbage time sort of get one, which the Ravens kind of took their foot off the gas a bit. But during preseason, Jake Browning completed 65% of his passes, had 42 of 64, 450 yards and a touchdown in 3 games. He did earn this backup role ahead of Trevor Siemian. And he's been around the league for a few years, so he does understand the game and stuff, but he hasn't really played. I'm not sure that T. Higgins is going to play. I don't understand why it would make sense to rush him back as a pending free agent. I don't understand why he would rush back. But I'd be confident enough in starting Jamar Chase. This Pittsburgh defense, they are poor against wide receivers. They've allowed the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. They've also allowed the 13th most running back fantasy points. Joe Mixon, he's setting a career high in snaps at 73%, along with seeing his opportunity share jump up to 86% this year. That's 15% more than his career average of 71%. Samaje Perine left, and Joe Mixon has just taken all of the touches. And even though he's getting older and he's not quite got the same burst he has, the volume's kind of made up for it. So I don't mind starting Mixon or Chase, but that would be about it for me.
Yeah, I think that this Bengals offense is probably going to mirror what we saw from them with Joe Burrow under center in kind of week 2, week 3. I think that ADOT is going to plummet. I wouldn't be surprised if Jamar Chase ADOT is probably sub 5 with these next few weeks. I think they're going to try and get the ball out of Browning's hands as quickly as possible and just almost say, go and feast after the catch, Chase, which, yeah, it could limit as soon as those teams are going to start creeping down the safeties. It's going to make Joe Mixon's life harder. It's going to make Chase's life harder because, you've got nothing opening up over the top. But I just think it's probably going to be quite a simple, fast pace to get the ball out offense rather than pushing the ball downfield. We've got a couple of questions here. So Joe's in the chat saying, looking for a running back, should I trade Cooper Kupp for Derrick Henry full PPR?
It's a tricky one because, we're coming around to the time of year where Derrick Henry gets going, but Tajay Spears has had 30 touches in his last 4 games. So the kind of role which Henry's normally had isn't quite there. I think I would look to trade Kupp for someone that I believed in slightly more. I don't know whether you could package up like Devin Singletary plus something else on top of it, a running back with a role that feels better, perhaps. I don't know. How do you feel about it, Rich?
Yeah, I think I'd rather Kupp straight up, even if I was running back needy. I know Derrick Henry's got that quite appealing playoff run, but I think Cooper Kupp could be a league winner if he gets healthy. It's looking like it's a 1-week injury. I think I'd still rather the upside of Kupp. So if you're going to go and trade Kupp away, like you say, Tom, I think add another piece to Kupp and maybe go and swim in a slightly bigger pool. And then NBA Riggs got a starting question. So he's saying Jalen Warren, Zach Moss, or AJ Dillon. This is Warren by a landslide for me.
Absolute landslide.
Yeah, perfect. Well, on that landslide, let's dive across to an interesting game at the early slate. Jacksonville at Houston. This is the battle of the young, hyped, future superstar quarterbacks. Which way do you see this one going?
It would be really nice to see Trevor Lawrence come out and have another really good fantasy game. Last week was his first game over 18 fantasy points all year, and obviously he smashed that. He had 32. And it'd be great to see Calvin Ridley come out and ball out after going like 8 for 122 and 2 touchdowns. But the Texans, They've been a kind of up and down team in terms of their defense. There's been games where they've really clamped down on opposing wide receivers. We saw it against Marquise Brown a couple of weeks ago. We've seen Derek Stingley is now back and healthy and looks to be playing well. So try to predict how the Jaguars passing game goes feels really difficult. Evan Ingram has had 4 receptions per game over the last couple, but he's had no more than 29 yards in the last 2. But that is an area where you can get at the Texans. They've allowed the second most fantasy points to tight ends. So if you're looking for a DFS dart throw this week, Evan Ingram feels kind of okay. His price is getting down and down because he isn't producing. Christian Kirk, he just kind of has that safe floor of like 45 to 50 receiving yards. And the boom weeks really come when he gets in the end zone. And, that can be hard to predict. I think you just got to take him on a week-by-week case of what your lineup needs, whether you can afford to sit him or, whether you feel the matchup is really good. We saw Zay Jones back last week for the first time since like week 4. And he didn't have a huge impact in terms of what he did on the field. He had 4 receptions for 20 yards. So, yeah, it's tricky. I think Travis Etienne, it'd be great to see him get going. He hasn't finished inside the top 20 running backs for the last 2 weeks. The Texans allow the 18th most fantasy points to running backs. So, that's kind of middle tier, nothing too great, nothing too bad. And I would expect, though, in DFS tournaments, the majority of ownership leans towards the Texans because they're just straight out balling. I mean, you look at Tank Dell, you talked about in this week's Dynasty Rise and Fallers video. Wherever you're at with Tank Dell, you probably need to bump him higher because he's been a top 12 wide receiver in back-to-back weeks. Nico Collins came back, had 7 receptions for 65 yards. And it came kind of at the expense of Dalton Schultz, who had a season-low 7% target share, but was saved by the touchdown. And again, that's an area that the Jags struggle to defend. They've allowed the 9th most tight end fantasy points, so maybe we see a Dalton Schultz bounce back. I think Devin Singletary, I'd have full confidence playing him again. He's been a top 8 back in back-to-back weeks, 100-plus rushing yards in both of them. The Jags, they allow the 17th most running back fantasy points. Again, just middle of the table sort of stuff. So it feels like this is a game which could go many different ways, and I think that it's going to be a game which I'll probably heavily attack in DFS. And just, hopefully we see some consistency from the Jags, because otherwise it feels like the Texans are going to be breathing down the neck in that AFC South division.
Yeah, I mean, the Tank Dell hype seems absolutely ridiculous. I thought I was really high in terms of Dynasty circles. I've put him as my wide receiver 20. I put out my wide receiver ranks on Twitter, and the number one comment I got back was, you need to bump Tank Dell up. You need to bump Tank Dell up. And I was thinking, I'm so much higher than consensus, and people are telling me I'm still too low. It's wild. The Travis Etienne trend, I don't think we've probably touched on it enough. I don't think people are talking about it enough at the moment. He's had an under 60% opportunity share the last 2 weeks. You said that he's not produced the last 2 weeks. It's suddenly gone from Tanks Bigsby isn't getting it done. Let's give Travis Etienne all the work. And he was getting north of 80, 90% opportunity share. He was getting all the receiving work. He was getting everything. And the last 2 weeks, they've suddenly gone, boom. He's now only a split backfield. He's not getting the work. Dearness Johnson's getting serious run. Tank Bigsby's still getting the short yardage work. I think this is a real concern, because if this is how they're going to have this offense moving forward, I think Travis Etienne's no longer an RB1, which is mad, because this is a guy that was probably a top 2-3 running back as little as 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think one of the things that, like, when you looked at Travis Etienne's numbers last year, after the Jags cut James Robinson and really turned the ball over to him, he wasn't hyper effective on a lot of touches. He wasn't good inside the red zone. Like, there were plenty of flaws with his game, which is why they went out and got Tank Bigsby. And if this is just a case of Travis Etienne is one of those running backs who can't hold up to a real volume-based sort of week in, week out role, then I would be potentially worried and potentially looking to trade him in redraft, or, if you're a contender and looking for a bit more of a sure thing down the stretch.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely something to monitor this week. We'll call 2 weeks a blip. I think 3 weeks is definitely a trend. NBA Riggs back. He's saying Stroud better dynasty value than T-Law. For me, I'm still T-Law over Stroud, but I think I'm probably dying on that hill. I'm very much a T-Law believer.
Yeah, I think it's the gap's getting pretty close, but I would stay with a bigger sample of Trevor Lawrence for me.
Yeah, no, perfect. Now let's dive across. We'll stay down south. Tampa Bay at Indianapolis. The Colts off the bye week. We saw the last week before the bye, Jonathan Taylor, 96% opportunity share. Zach Moss basically been sat down and said, we're not going to use you at all. Do you think that Jonathan Taylor is here to win people championships as we get down to this fantasy stretch?
I certainly hope so, given that I traded for him in the league we're in and gave up quite a lot of future picks. And yeah, you mentioned 96% opportunity share pre-buy, but over the last 2 weeks, he was averaging 2.8 yards per carry. So it wasn't like he was particularly impressive with that role. I do think that the Zach Moss kind of effect, we are kind of possibly past that, and that the Colts, they're in evaluation mode on stuff. Obviously, they know they've got their quarterback now in Anthony Richardson, but you don't cut players like Shaq Leonard yesterday without having one eye on the future and working out what you want to do. And they need to know whether they can count on JT for a full volume-based workload, or whether they need to keep someone like Zach Moss around, whether they need to go out and draft another running back to take off some of the work for him. Michael Pittman, I mentioned it earlier with one of the questions. He's had more targets than AJ Brown or CeeDee Lamb this year. He's on pace for 167. He is one of those players who I just feel comfortable starting every single week right now. I think you can plug him in, and there'll be weeks where he has slight down weeks, but on the whole, he's been fantastic. And Tampa Bay, they've given up plenty of big weeks to opposing wide receivers. They've allowed the 5th most wide receiver fantasy points this year. Josh Downs, if he can play, I haven't seen anything about him yet. I know he had his knee injury before the bye.
He's practicing.
He's practicing. That's good, because the Bucs allow the 1st most slot receiver fantasy points, and that's an area which he definitely mixed in and out of. Gardner Minshew, he's at 15.2 fantasy points in his last 2 combined. I think if you're looking for anything from Gardner Minshew, even as your QB3, now is the time to go out and improve on that, because he's not a fantasy relevant quarterback. He's not a particularly good quarterback either. No, exactly. And we've always been on that train. On the other side of it, I think, talking of quarterbacks who aren't particularly good, Baker Mayfield, he's been getting by like at times, and it's probably gone unnoticed and under talked about that he's been a top 12 quarterback in 3 of the last 4. But the little things are creeping back in. He's been sacked 15 times in the last 5 games. We're seeing more interceptions than we were at the start of the season. Last week against the Niners, it was just one of those classic Baker Mayfield interceptions where he just stares down the middle of the field, steps into it so confidently, and just throws it straight to a defender. So I think we're kind of at where we are with him. We know that Mike Evans is going to see 8 targets a game. In the weeks where he scores touchdowns, he's going to be very valuable. We're talking like wide receiver 15 average in weeks where he scores a touchdown. When he doesn't, he averages wide receiver 39 performances. Chris Godwin, he's a 2 top 25 performances all year. If you're using Chris Godwin as anything more than a flex play at this point, then you need to be looking for a way to upgrade on it. Indy do allow sort of a decent amount of wide receiver points for kind of middle of the table in terms of amount of wide receiver fantasy points they allow per game. Where they have struggled at times this year has been against running backs. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. So I like Rachaad White here. We know 3.3 yards per carry is kind of what we get from him. But he's had 7 targets in 2 of the last 4 games. He's averaged 96 total yards over the last 5 games. And then Cade Otton as well has a pretty good matchup. The Colts allow the 7th most fantasy points to 2 tight ends. Cade Otton's only had 1 game over 50 yards all season, and he's only had 2 with touchdowns. But if you're looking for a dart throw in DFS, if you're looking to heavily stack this game, which, let's face it, there are ways that this game could be one of the most fun and fantasy viable in the 6 p.m. games, then I don't mind adding Cade Otton into stacks.
Yeah, I think this has got some sneaky upside, this matchup. Both defenses are pretty poor, let's be honest. And let's follow the money. Yes, it's a 44 over-under, which isn't particularly high, but 99% of the cash currently bet at Vegas is on the over. So I'm expecting this over-under to start creeping up perhaps as we get towards Sunday. So maybe it becomes a slightly more intriguing matchup, and you can see some points start to be scored. Moving across to the next matchup, which isn't a particularly interesting matchup. I'm not expected to see a lot of points scored. New England at the Giants. Is this just a case, Tom, of start Ramondre, start Saquon Barkley, and forget about anyone else in this matchup?
Pretty much. It just feels like this one is going to get ugly. I feel like that there's not a whole lot of players that I'd want to play. I think from a pure NFL situation, the most interesting part would be the Mac Jones situation. We've seen Bill Belichick, we've seen Bill O'Brien this week talk about how, they've prepared both Bailey Zappi and both Mac Jones to play. And it sounds like he is on a razor's edge right now. He's 34th in EPA per drop back among quarterbacks with 50 dropbacks or more. And there's nobody consistent really on the Patriots side. Ramondre, his last 5 finishes, RB6, RB15, RB38, RB2, RB20. But he has looked better. Like between weeks 1 to 5, he was averaging 2.7 yards per carry. Since week 6, he's averaging 5.3 yards per carry. So I'd start Ramondre simply because the Giants are poor against the run. They've allowed like 4.5 yards per carry. They allow the 11th most running back fantasy points. And it does feel like Ramondre is rounding into kind of decent form at a time of year we need him to. Demario Douglas, he's had 23 targets in the last 3, but it's not really good for fantasy production. Juju, he played 98% of snaps versus the Colts and got 1 target. Like, it's just a little bit sad, that whole situation, really. And then Hunter Henry, between weeks 1 to 4, had 44 yards per game, but now since then it's dropped out to 20.3. So yeah, Ramondre Stevenson or bust on the New England side. Then on the Giants, I mean, last week the Giants just kind of blew us all away with that pluckier than expected performance, really. Tommy DeVito's got more multi-touchdown passing games than Kenny Pickett now. The last time that Daniel Jones threw for 3 touchdowns was week 16 of 2019, which was his rookie year.
Wow.
Since then, he's played 50 games and not managed to get like 3 touchdowns in a game. But yeah, as you said, Saquon, he's averaging 112 scrimmage yards per game since week 6. The Patriots, they allow middle of the table, sort of 15th most fantasy points to running backs. New England are particularly vulnerable to slot wide receivers, but I don't think I can bring myself to start Wan'Dale Robinson. I mean, it's just been diabolical, really, for the Giants outside of Saquon.
Yeah, I think, let's be honest, the only winner out of this matchup is whichever team loses and kind of gets that first foot in the door to that number 2 pick, which could realistically completely transform both of these franchises and where they're going right now. Talking of transforming, we've got 2 teams that are hoping to be transformed by young future quarterbacks that, let's be honest, Bryce Young's disappointing. What has been built around him is falling apart. Will Levis shown some flashes, but the consistency's not there. With those 2 young quarterbacks under center, have you got any hope for anything fantasy relevant in these 2 games?
It's tricky because on paper, the Panthers' defense aren't a particularly fruitful one for opposing teams. But that's more because teams tend to get a lead on them and then they're just not pushed whatsoever. Carolina, so on paper, allow the 4th fewest quarterback fantasy points, the 5th fewest wide receiver fantasy points, the 4th fewest slot wide receiver fantasy points, the 9th fewest tight end fantasy points. But where they've absolutely hemorrhaged points has been running backs because teams build up that lead and just able to run all over them, and they allow the 2nd most running back fantasy points. So this feels like the kind of week where we should be getting a vintage Derrick Henry performance if there's one of those left in the tank. I mentioned earlier that Tajay Spears has seen 30 touches over the last 4 games. So he is mixing into a point which has been uncomfortable for Derrick Henry. After the last 2 games, Derrick Henry combined for less than 9 PPR points. That was after 3 consecutive games over 16. So maybe it's to get the right spot he needs. I'm not expecting Will Levis to go off a lot. He scored those 26 points in his debut, but then took him 3 games to pass that total across 3 combined performances. So I think you can start DeAndre Hopkins if you need. I think you can start Tajay Spears as a dart throw. Derrick Henry, I'd start with confidence. On the Carolina side, we saw Miles Sanders suddenly become much more involved again, and that feels like it was noteworthy because Frank Reich took over calling plays again, and Miles Sanders had his most snaps since week 5. Adam Thielen had his most productive fantasy game in several weeks, back to being a top 20 wide receiver again. And that feels like this is where the Panthers can have success against the Titans, because Tennessee will have 5th most fantasy points to opposing slot receivers. But outside of that, yeah, there's no point taking dart throws on Chigozie Okonkwo. There's no point worrying about DJ Chark or Jonathan Mingo, because they're just not very good players and they're not getting it done whatsoever.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue with this Carolina team is that their offensive line is so bad. They aren't allowing Bryce Young any time to push the ball down the field. Like his time to throw is ridiculously slow. He's attempting less than 6% of passes more than 20 yards downfield, which is the lowest amount in the league by a big distance. Will Levis is over 25% of those passes attempted 20 yards downfield. And there's no sign of that improving. This is the kind of game I can see where Mike Vrabel is just going to sit those safeties in the box and say, try and beat us deep. We don't think you've got it in you. And I think that this could get ugly fast. And it's going to be a Tennessee, hopefully, vintage game with Derrick Henry running out the clock because they're 2 scores up.
Yeah, and going back to your point about the offensive line, both starting guards are going to be out for the Panthers this week. Like, losing key interior line players like that, like, it's one thing on the tackles, but like if you're getting pressure in your face straight away for a short quarterback like Bryce Young, who we've definitely seen at times his height has been an issue in the NFL, it just feels like it's going to get very, very miserable for him on Sunday.
Yeah, we saw the Saints consistently build around Drew Brees by investing over the odds at center and guard because they knew that he needed a clean pocket to step up in order to operate. Bryce Young's not even getting close to that right now. NBA Riggs back. Got another question. Looking for one to drop. Donta Foreman, Miles Sanders, Zach Moss, Tajay Spears. This is Zach Moss for me. Do you agree?
It's Donta Foreman for me. I think Roshan Johnson mixed in quite a bit last week. Khalil Herbert mixed in. You know, he's back from IR, and I feel like Donta Foreman is possibly going to lose out on work very quickly, and what work he does get isn't going to be great.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think I'd lean Moss because I think he's not doing it. At no point is he ever entering your lineup. I guess he's the only reason you'd keep him is he's the upside. He's a Jonathan Taylor injury away from being a top 12 back, and that's why you keep him. But if you need someone that you're plugging into your lineup, I can't see Zach Moss is ever getting close to it unless there's a Jonathan Taylor injury. If you are here, if you want to hear more of Tom's DFS content, he does a write-up for every single slate of games. He has gone over the top with his Thanksgiving Day write-up. It is absolutely wild, the level of detail he has gone to. You can hit that join button below. You can come into our Discord, become a member, become a team guy, and you will get access to all of my Dynasty content, my survival kit, my trade calculator, and of course, all of Tom's DFS content, and so much more. Moving on to the evening games, we got the Rams against the Cardinals. It feels like this could be some sneaky upside, maybe. 2 offenses. We've got Kyren Williams back. Kyler Murray starting to get his legs under him. You getting in some hype for this one?
I think, yeah, there's definitely some interest in this game. I think, you know, the Kyren Williams stuff, like, is definitely interesting because the Rams have been run heavy all year, more so than we've probably seen at times under their Sean McVay era, and particularly in the red zone, they've been more run heavy there than I think any point that I can remember going back to, possibly around sort of like Todd Gurley era. Before Kyren Williams went on IR, he had 4 of 6 games with over 17 PPR points. The Cardinals, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs. So I'll be plugging him straight back in. I've got no concerns about him. I think he's the kind of running back who can give you week-winning performances. Cooper Kupp, if he plays, I'm probably going to try not to start him, which really hurts me. He was my wide receiver 1 coming into the year until his hamstring injury. But it's just not there. It's like Matthew Stafford isn't playing good enough. You know, he's averaging a 56 completion rate over his last 5 games. He's had 5 games below 60% this year, which just isn't what we need, particularly if you're talking about those kind of layup shots to Cooper Kupp. They should be easy completions. We should be seeing more of them. And of course, Puka Nacua is mixing into the slot a decent amount more. In previous years, we'd see Cooper Kupp well up over 50% slot snap rate. This year, it's kind of hovering around 45%. Puka, he had 18 points last week after 2 down games, one of them, of course, with Brett Ripien. And I think he'll have a very good week this week. The Cardinals allow the 10th most points to slot receivers, allow the 12th most fantasy points to wide receivers in general. They allow a league-high 72% completion rate to wide receivers because they just can't stop anything. I think, the defense has been pluckier than we expected on some levels. They've got some good players, but they don't stop the ball through the air. They don't stop the ball through the ground. And I would be confident that the Rams will be fairly safe bets. Tyler Higbee is somebody that I would avoid even in DFS, even if Cooper Kupp misses out. The Cardinals have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends this year. And Tyler Higbee's had 0 touchdowns, 0 fantasy relevance. And unless he starts catching touchdowns, he's just not going to be relevant. On the Cardinals side of things, for me, it's really, can Hollywood Brown get going? We expected all offseason, the talk was you draft Hollywood Brown because when Kyler Murray comes back, he's going to have a 30+% target share. It's just going to be explosive. We know the two of them have got a good relationship. And then in the first 2 games back, we see 3.5 PPR points average across those 2 games with Kyler. That is miserable. I mean, we saw Rondale Moore get 9 targets in Kyler Murray's first game back. And then last week, it was Greg Dortch who got 8 targets. So try to decipher the wide receiver room feels very tricky. Rondale saved his day last week with a touchdown. Greg Dortch, I don't think anyone expected that performance. Everyone was kind of focused on whether Michael Wilson played or not. But the guy you've talked about for 2, maybe 3 weeks in a row on the Dynasty Rises and Fallers video, Trey McBride, it's absolute elite production. Since week 8, he's 3rd in tight end targets per game. And the Rams allow the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends. So I think you can plug and play him again for another good week.
Yeah, I think Trey McBride, look, I love the guy. I was hyping him up before the season. I was hyping him up as a rookie, and I'm so pleased to see him finally get the shares and the opportunity. I think for me, he's a top 5 tight end rest of season, which sounds wild to say, but that's the way he's producing since Zach Ertz went down. Marquise Brown, I know the stats aren't there. I know the production's not been there. And yes, I don't play in any points per nearly catch leagues, but he has been so close the last 2 weeks to some explosive catches down the sideline. And it just feels like it's coming. So, yeah, I don't know if I have the confidence to plug and play him this week, but it's almost there. And hopefully, Kyron Williams, hopefully you've been listening to me over the last month and you've gone out and bought some shares because this guy was an absolute stud when he was playing. I've never seen a guy that's produced as he did be as cheap as he has in Dynasty leagues over the last 3-4 weeks. I think that window is about to come slamming shut on Sunday because I'm expecting some big points against this Cardinals. We got some questions in the chat, though. First of all, Cal Chad saying he's looking to heavy stack Giants Pats. It's not a tactic I'd use, Tom.
I'm not even sure what heavy stacks involves in that game. I mean, are you going Jalen Hyatt and hoping he gets more than 1 catch? Are you hoping that Darius Slayton clears concussion protocol? Are you hoping that Daniel Bellinger suddenly becomes relevant again? I think maybe you get
positive side. At least it'd be low ownership.
Yeah, I mean, it will definitely be low ownership. I think maybe if you wanted to go, okay, Tommy DeVito, Saquon Barkley, Ramondre Stevenson, and Demario Douglas. But yeah, I think, I think there's possibly stacks I'd be more keen to play. And if you want access to those stacks, I do a DFS clinic video every week for our YouTube members. If you hit join below, you get that. And 15 minutes, I talk about my cash game core of the players I want to play in cash every week, the GPP stacks that I'm using as building blocks, and all the leverage points and good chalk and bad chalk every week.
There we go. Ricky's in the chat asking Hollywood, McLaurin, Noah Brown, start 1. It's Terry McLaurin for me.
I'd go Hollywood.
Okay, we'll disagree there. Irvin Sanchez, pick 3, Saquon, Tony Pollard, Kyron Williams, Monty. I'm sitting Montgomery there.
That's thrown me a bit there. I think... yeah, maybe just Monty. If not, it'd be Saquon.
Yeah. And then Evans asking, rest of season, Khalil Herbert or Fournette?
Khalil Herbert. I mean, Fournette's not even been elevated to a game day squad yet.
Yeah, I was
And the
about to
Bills,
say he's still on the practice squad, so I'm
yeah,
fine with Herbert there.
and the way the Bills use their running backs just isn't conducive enough for me to want to give up anyone like Khalil Herbert who feels more explosive.
Yeah, and I agree. NBA Riggs that I reckon we might see more sacks than points in the Giants versus the Patriots game on Sunday. Right, the next matchup. This feels like this could be a very low scoring affair. Two defenses that are playing absolute phenomenal football right now. Cleveland at Denver. Anybody you want to try and get into DFS lineups now?
So, not particularly. I think, you look at the Browns and they allow the least quarterback fantasy points, second fewest wide receiver fantasy points, the least tight end fantasy points, the eighth fewest running back fantasy points. So it becomes very difficult to picture who the Broncos is going to get there. What we've seen from the Broncos has been excellent over the last few games. Like, we really can't take anything away from the fact that Russell Wilson has bought into the Sean Payton experience. He is dink and dunking much more than we've ever seen. He's throwing to running backs as often as wide receivers. I think last week it was 18 wide receiver targets to 14 running back targets. And he's been a top 18 quarterback for 4 weeks in a row. Part of that has come because of this ridiculous streak from Cortland Sutton, who's managed to score a touchdown in all but 2 appearances this year, leads the league with 8 red zone touchdowns. But I don't believe that Cortland Sutton's going to find a particularly productive day against this Browns defense. I think, you look at what the Browns do, they'll have the fewest receptions to wide receivers per game at just 8.6. And I don't think that this Broncos wide receiver room is good enough that they can kind of overcome that, really. Javonte, he had back-to-back games with 25 plus touches, and then it went down to 13 against the Vikings, which is a little concerning. Because at 25 touches per game, even against an elite defense, you can tell yourself a story that he's possibly going to get there on volume. If we see 10 to 13 to 15, I'm a little more skeptical that Javonte could get there. And then on the Browns side, Jerome Ford, he only had a 48% opportunity share in week 11 after averaging 61% between weeks 9 to 10. So we kind of had the rug pulled out on us a little bit. A little bit there. David Njoku has continued to be fine with or without Deshaun Watson. But yeah, DTR, he's yet to throw a touchdown. Average depth of target of 3.4 yards last week. That's just not going to get it done.
Yeah, it feels like as long as DTR is under center, basically David Njoku is a plug and play top 12 tight end just based on the average depth of target and the volume of targets. I think it was 15 targets last week. As you said, DTR is not pushing the ball downfield, and that basically takes Amari Cooper and his route tree out of the game. So we're just going to see David Njoku get peppered with targets and Elijah Moore on kind of schemed touches. So, yeah, I don't particularly have any interest in attacking this game for this week's slate whatsoever. We got a couple of questions. Evans asking, pick 2, Ridley, Hopkins, Warren. For me, it's Ridley and Warren.
Yep, agree.
Yeah, and then Dom is asking, do I start Dak over Hurts?
I've
got Dak QB3 and Hurts QB2 this week, so I'd still go Hurts, but let's be honest, it's not a bad decision to be making, is it?
Yeah, I think I'd possibly just lean towards Dak, but I mean, it's coin flip.
Yeah, perfect. The next matchup on this evening slate, we've got Kansas City at the Raiders. Obviously, Antonio Pierce has got the Raiders playing ball, winning games, but Josh Jacobs' usage, after saying he's going to, build the team around him, they've basically stopped giving him any usage in the passing game. His point production hasn't ticked up like we hoped. I called him a potential league winner a couple of weeks ago. Do you think now that, we can get back on board with Jacobs, or do you think he's now a back-end RB1 behind RB2?
The most concerning thing for me wasn't even the passing game usage. It was just, that in general, he just got scripted out of the game and get a bit against the Dolphins. In the previous 3 games, he'd averaged 104 scrimmage yards, and then that dropped down by a half to 51 against Miami. And I think this game for me actually feels like one which could be sneaky low in points. I think the Chiefs' defense is absolutely legitimate, and what we saw against the Eagles is how the Chiefs are going to have to win games this year by hoping that their defense can do enough. They allow the seventh fewest quarterback fantasy points, the ninth fewest running back fantasy points, the eighth fewest wide receiver fantasy points. So I don't see how the Raiders are going to move the ball. But then on the other side of this, the Raiders have been a good pass defense themselves. They've allowed the 13 fewest quarterback fantasy points, to 13 fewest wide receiver fantasy points, to 13 fewest tight end fantasy points. What they haven't been good against is the run, where they've allowed the fifth most fantasy points. So do we see Pacheco come out and really ball out? He's had 18 touches a game since week 4, but he rarely ever gets over 100 yards, which makes it difficult to play him on DraftKings because you want players with that 3-point bonus. And he's only had 4 touchdowns this year. So if you're out there getting 70 yards, that's great. But if you're not getting huge pass game volume, it doesn't really turn into a good fantasy day. I think that the Chiefs need to get something going because the offense just kind of looks a little bit broken, really. Mahomes has been outside quarterback 10 in 5 of the last 7, which seems mad for a player of Mahomes' stature. Kelsey got back up into the top 12 tight ends after 2 games outside there. But you look at what they were doing this week, and Justin Watson's getting 11 targets. He's a player who, we've really barely ever seen on the field at times. Kadarius Toney, they seem to be making an effort to really get him involved coming off the bye. 4 touches for 26 yards. It's just not good enough. MVS, that drop was egregious, possibly even worse than the Quentin Johnston one. I mean, they're both, playing both on a loop, and both of them were horrendous. So I don't have a lot of interest in this game. You start Mahomes, you start Kelsey if you've got him in redraft in Dynasty. You start Isaiah Pacheco because he's got a really good matchup. On the other side of this, Devontae Adams has given us a little bit more hope because he's back-to-back games with 80-plus yards, and he scored his first touchdown since week 3. But the Chiefs have been excellent against wide receivers all year. They have one of the best teams at holding wide receiver ones in check. We saw it against A.J. Brown this week. And now are we going to tell ourselves a story that Devontae Adams can overcome that whilst he's got Aiden O'Connell throwing him the ball? I'm pretty skeptical, to be honest. And Hunter Renfrow, seeing a season-high 5 targets, if anything, aiding the Jacoby Myers workload enough that it becomes difficult to trust him. So if you need to start Devontae Adams, you probably should, but I don't feel very good about that one whatsoever. And Josh Jacobs, I think you have to start. But again, for me, this is one of those games which is just a very easy fade for DFS this weekend.
Yeah, it feels like the Adams play is purely just hoping on volume. We talk about a 43 over under. 99% of the cash is on the under again. So I think this is a matchup that people are expecting to play the under. And, the Chiefs, I think they're 30th in points scored as an offense in the second half so far this year. It just feels like this could be the Chiefs get 2 scores up early and then just run the game out, and it's a boring, low-scoring affair that's not going to achieve anything for fantasy. So let's move on to perhaps the game of the week, the matchup of the week. The Buffalo Bills, fresh off beating a horrendous New York Jets team, going up against the team in the league, the team that are the highest odds to win the Super Bowl now, Philadelphia Eagles. Tom, is this one you're trying to get as much into those DFS lineups as possible?
Yeah, so we've talked about it a little bit, but in terms of a DFS game theory point of view, the early slate for this game week looks terrible. And if you can fade all the early games and just really kind of heavily attack a game like this one, then I'd be in favor of that. I mean, we look at the Eagles' defense this year, and they are just a complete pass funnel. They allow the least running back fantasy points per game, but they allow the 4th most quarterback fantasy points. They allow a league high wide receiver fantasy points. They allow the 3rd most slot receiver points, the 11th most tight end fantasy points. So you can absolutely pass on them. You can absolutely run against them as a quarterback. They are not a tough defense to pass on. So it's wheels up for all the Bills players. But then on the other side, you look at the Bills secondary, and it's been banged up for weeks. We saw two of their players in the secondary go down and get injured last week, and they really couldn't afford that to start with. So I think that we're talking about being able to start AJ Brown with absolute confidence. Devonta Smith, after 3 weeks outside the top 40 wide receivers, has now had 3 inside the top 18. The Eagles really did very little to try and involve any of these tight ends who are on the roster, with Dallas Goedert missing out. DeAndre Swift, I think you can start him with a fair amount of confidence because the Bills allow the 10th most running back fantasy points, but they also allow the 3rd most running back receiving yards per game. DeAndre Swift's been pretty consistent this year. He's averaging 88.7 scrimmage yards per game. He has dropped off slightly in the receiving game, though. He's not had more than 3 targets in the last 4 games, but this feels like a game where he can take it over. On the Bills side, James Cook's kind of like, we see what it's going to be like with James Cook. There are going to be weeks where they lean more on Latavius Murray or perhaps even Leonard Fournette at some point. Was it Ty Johnson last week getting carries? But he's had back-to-back games with 100 yards total, and I think he's kind of like RB2, RB3 territory player, and there will be weeks where it works out and weeks where it doesn't. But, you know, we want players on that kind of like fun offense like that, and Stephon Diggs, he's only had 7 catches over the last 2 games, been the wide receiver 53 in back-to-back weeks, which is crazy. But this is the get-right spot. We talked, like as I mentioned, the Eagles just can't stop the pass. Dalton Kincaid's just been straight balling. Since week 8 onwards, he's averaging 60 yards per game, 6.5 catches per game, and he's been tight end 7 or better in every single game, and that's a position which the Eagles struggle against. So, yeah, Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Dalton Kincaid, with DeAndre Swift and AJ Brown on the other side of it. Like, that feels like the kind of onslaught which might be tricky to make work with salary, but if you can find a way to make it work, then that's how I'd like to attack this game.
And we've seen that the Bills obviously traded for Rasul Douglas, who has playing some really good football, looking like he fits. NBA Riggs asking, will those Bills, try and shut down AJ Brown? Do you think it could be Devonta Smith or AJ Brown in this week?
I think that's the kind of question which, yeah, it could easily be Devonta Smith. You know, last week Devonta Smith caught that touchdown at the 1, and the moment he fell down and was touched at the 1, it was just like, well, that's it. That's a Jalen Hurts sneak. And it's so painful to see it. But yeah, otherwise, Devonta Smith could have had an incredible week last week. I do think Devonta Smith was rounding in form at the right time of year where he could really start going off. But I mean, it just feels like coin flip to try and decide which one of those wide receivers is going to have a better week unless you've got a good feel on it, Rich.
No, I agree. I think I'd lean AJ Brown straight up, but I think they could both. Look, I want to start every piece I can in this offense. Let's be honest. It's I think it's going to be a high-scoring affair. And then Ray's in the chat asking, do I trade Justin Jefferson, Breece Hall for, I presume that's AJ Brown and Sam Laporta. I have Ingram for tight end. I have Montgomery, Bijan, Achane. If you need, he's saying he's 5-6 and needs a win this week. If you absolutely need a win this week, I can see it. But I don't love trading for Laporta when you've got Evan Ingram. I don't love trading away Justin Jefferson, who, is going to be a league winner. Right? I think I'd rather roll with Justin Jefferson, Breece Hall, and try and take my chances. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think, if you need that win, then you need it. And, I've made plenty of bad injury-related trades and stuff like that over the last few years when I needed a win. But it doesn't feel amazing.
No. If you are here, if you're asking those questions, if you're watching us, make sure you hit that thumbs up button because it really helps and it spreads the word. And if you do want your questions answered, even if you're not watching live, if you're watching this back on YouTube, leave those questions in the comments below. Tom and I will answer 100% of the questions we get, whether it's trade, start sit, what we had for breakfast, or anything in between. Moving across to the Sunday night game, your Baltimore Ravens at the Chargers. We talked about how bad the Chargers are on defense. Looks like, could this be Lamar Jackson getting Brandon Staley fired this week?
Well, Lamar's been fantastic in primetime games on a number of occasions throughout his career. And it just seems like he is one of those players who can really shine. Like last week on Thursday Night Football, he was back in the top 5 QBs for the first time in 3 weeks. And it was getting to that point where fantasy managers were definitely getting rather annoyed with the lack of passing touchdowns. But I mean, this Ravens offense, we've scored 30 plus points for 4 weeks in a row. which is a huge amount of points to be scoring consistently. Lamar's averaged 51 rushing yards over the last 3 games. And even without Mark Andrews, there are going to be games where it's going to be difficult and Lamar's going to be looking for that safety valve and it's just not there. But I don't think it's going to be against this Chargers defense, who allow the second most wide receiver fantasy points, the 4th most slot wide receiver points, the 3rd most tight end fantasy points. So perhaps it's wheels up for Isaiah Likely. We saw it in limited points last year where against the Bucs, where he came in and was dominant. But they also allow the 7th most fantasy points to running backs. So it feels like the Ravens can go in and do whatever they want here. They could lean run heavy. We could have another game where Gus Edwards is just diving into the end zone for his 10th touchdown in 6 games. It sounds like Odell Beckham might miss this game. He didn't practice today. He's got a shoulder injury, which is a shame, coming off 100 yards for the first time in a ridiculously long time. But he'd had 100 yards or a touchdown in each of the last 3 games, been a wide receiver 32 or better in all of them. Zay Flowers has also been having a couple of really nice games. The touchdowns haven't been there. Last week, he had a 60-yard one called back incorrectly for a terrible call. But in week 1, when Mark Andrews didn't play, the Ravens absolutely fed Zay Flowers. He had 11 touches that week. Rashad Bateman getting back involved, had his first touchdown all year, and they're starting to really try and make that deep shot work to him. So perhaps that works. On the other side of it, try to work out how the Chargers are going to attack the Ravens is really difficult, because outside of Keenan Allen, the Chargers just have nothing right now. Quentin Johnson is an absolute zero. Jalen Guyton missed out last week. I'm not sure if he's going to be healthy for this week. Gerald Everett missed out last week, and Donald Parham didn't do much. Keenan Allen, he's had 30 targets in his last 2 games, back-to-back 100-plus yard games. But the Ravens, they allow the 5th fewest wide receiver fantasy points. Marlon Humphrey's going to be healthy this week. Their secondary's been a real strength over the last few games. Perhaps it turns into an Austin Eckler game, because the Ravens have allowed 9th most fantasy points to running backs this year. And it looks like Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen are starting to get a little bit tired, and they could do with slightly less snaps. But Austin Eckler, since week 6, is averaging 3.4 yards per carry. He's had less than 25 receiving yards in 2 of the last 3. And if you saw the clip last week of him jogging to the sideline, it was brutal how slow he looked. And yeah, I just, maybe I'm being biased, but the Ravens at 3.5 points, I just think this is going to be a full touchdown of the Ravens.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I'm really not excited about this Chargers team. I think what Justin Herbert and Kellen Moore are doing is working absolute wonders, because the offensive line is struggling. The rest of this team is banged up, and they've got no explosion, nobody exciting in this offense at all. I wrote about Austin Eckler in my article for our members. I think that he is a must sell if you're in Dynasty and you're not contender. I think he's probably still going to be fantasy relevant towards the end of the year, just getting there on volume alone. We know he's going to get that high volume of targets, but he looks slow. Yes, he's probably still recovering slightly from the ankle injury, but he's 28. He's going to be 29 in the offseason. He's a free agent at the end of this year. I'd be shocked if any team's going to pay him money in free agency. He knew that. That's the reason why he held out and wanted more money at the beginning of the season. I think if you're looking towards any future in Dynasty, you need to be getting out of Austin Eckler as quickly as you can. Moving across to the final matchup, Monday Night Football. It doesn't feel particularly exciting, let's be honest. Chicago at Minnesota. Is this just going to be a case of 2 quarterbacks running around as much as they can and doing nothing else?
Well, that's it. It's two elite dual threats, isn't it? Like, probably both better at running than they are actually passing the ball. Justin Fields had a season-high 18 rush attempts last week. And the word coming from the insiders last week was that Chicago wants Fields to play like himself, to not worry about things, and to really embrace the running work. And he did that. He ended up with 104 yards against the Lions defense that, we definitely feel confident about more often than not. And he played well. There was plenty of times in the passing game that he was doing well. But from a fantasy point of view, he has to get there, because he's only had 1 passing touchdown in all but 2 of his healthy games this year. In terms of other Bears players, DJ Moore, he was the wide receiver 6 last week. He really struggled with Tyson Bagent. it wasn't working for him. He was rarely over like 11, 12 PPR points. But then last week, 40% target share, big long touchdown, everything that you want DJ Moore to be. Cole Kmet, though, it went the other way. He'd done well with Tyson Bagent, but then goes to 3 for 20 with Justin Fields. And that's just a Cole Kmet experience. You never know when you're going to be able to start him. The talent, it's probably there, but it's not a difference-making talent, and it's not somebody I'd ever want to roster in any form of fantasy outside of best ball. Running back, we talked about it briefly earlier on. Donta Foreman went out of the game last week with an injury. Khalil Herbert averaged 2.2 yards per carry on 16 attempts, which is woeful, whilst Roschon Johnson had 5 yards per carry. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a point where Roschon Johnson is getting more of the ball. The Vikings, they're no slouch against the run. They sort of allowed the 13th fewest points to running backs. Where you get the Vikings is through the air. The wide receivers have gained the 9th most points against the Vikings. On the other side of the ball, yeah, Josh Dobbs, his lowest rushing output since week 5 with only 21 yards, but he's a rushing touchdown in the last 5. That's an incredible floor to gain. Like, I think that really helps. Ty Chandler, he's went 10 for 73, looked great. You talked about him on the Risers and Fallers Dynasty video. Back-to-back weeks as a top 30 running back. And it just kind of coincided with Alexander Mattison possibly feeling the heat under his seat and going 18 for 81 and playing a bit better than he's done in recent weeks. TJ Hawkinson, 455, his worst fantasy game since week 5. I think you can start him here because the Bears allow the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends, and it feels like that is going to click back into his favor. And Jordan Addison, you start him if you need to. He's averaged 55 yards over the last 3, but he hasn't scored a touchdown since week 8, and he's just in that kind of range of wide receivers where if they don't score a touchdown, they're not really going to give you a great day.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the call of Ty Chandler. I think he looks explosive. He looks so superior to Alexander Mattison. Hopefully, Kevin O'Connell agrees and we start to see him feed the ball more, and he could be a player that could be certainly fantasy relevant as we head down the stretch. A couple of final questions before we wrap up, though, Tom. Eric's asking, Pollard, Josh Jacobs, or Mostert? Who are you starting this week?
That's definitely not as fun as it should be, really. I think
I'm Pollard this week.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I lean towards Pollard. I would like to start Mostert against the Jets. It would probably be that order. Pollard, Mostert, then Jacobs.
Yeah, perfect. And then Theo Maniatis is saying, should I trade Pollard and Metcalf for Rashad White?
No, it's too much to give up for Rashad White. He's been good, but he's not a good runner. I think there's better deals to be had out there.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think if you're trading away Metcalf and Pollard, I need to be getting like a top 5 back. I'd need to be getting DeAndre Swift, Jamal Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, someone like that rather than Rashad White. I think he's potentially just nothing particularly exciting. And then NBA Rigged, final question, is Mattison the founding father back from concussion protocol this week? Yeah, he played last week, didn't he? So I think he's going to be fine this week.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, that concludes the show. That wraps up. We've gone through 16 games, our biggest preview yet. If you've made it this far and you've not hit the thumbs up, you've not hit the subscribe, what are you doing? An hour and 23 into the show and you've not done those 2 little things. Go ahead and do that now. Have a fantastic Thanksgiving. I hope you all have a wonderful time. Enjoy yourself, eat copious amounts of food, watch loads of football, and of course, hope you win all your fantasy matchups.